This video was brought to you by Nebula. For most of the past 15 years, Canada's economy has been the envy of much of the developed world. Canada weathered the 2008 financial crash perhaps better than any other developed country, and its impressive GDP, stable, progressive politics, and general good vibes meant that it was widely considered to be one of the most livable countries in the whole world. However, today things don't look quite so rosy. The headline numbers are still pretty good. Canada's GDP has grown faster than basically any other G7 country, apart from the US since the pandemic. But scratch the surface, and it quickly becomes clear that Canada doesn't live up to its international reputation. Productivity is stagnant, GDP per capita is actually falling, and its public services are painfully strained. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Canada's economy, and why things are getting worse. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, let's start by taking a look at the headline numbers. Like the rest of the world, Canada's economy has had a tough few years. Rising global food and energy prices pushed inflation up to a peak of 8.1% in June 2022, a level last reached during the oil price crisis of the late 70s and early 80s. However, the Canadian economy seemed to recover pretty well. After the central bank raised its benchmark interest rate of 0.25% in 2022 to a high of 5% in late 2023, inflation fell relatively quickly, dropping to 3.4% in May of 2023 and then stabilizing around 3% from January 2024 onwards. This was higher than the Bank of Canada's 2% target, but it was also low and stable enough that in June, Canada's central bank decided to cut rates, becoming the first G7 central bank to do so. What makes this look even more impressive is that Canada apparently continued to post relatively strong GDP growth during this steep rise in interest rates. At the same time as most of the global economy was stalled, Canada posted GDP growth of 3.8% in 2022 and 1.1% in 2023. Data from April also suggests that, in the first quarter of 2024, the Canadian economy grew by 1.7% year on year, below analysts' expectations of 2.2%, but well above basically every other G7 country apart from the US. Canada's apparent overperformance has drawn plaudits from international commentators. In June, the IMF praised Canada for achieving a so-called soft landing, i.e. bringing inflation down without incurring a recession. However, things don't look quite as good when you dig into the data. The main reason for this is that Canada's apparent growth has actually been driven by unprecedented amounts of immigration. In the third quarter of 2023 alone, Canada took in something like 400,000 immigrants, including both permanent and temporary residents, representing roughly 1% of the pre-existing population. In percentage terms, this was the largest influx of people into Canada since the second quarter of 1957, when the country received tens of thousands of refugees fleeing from the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. This is largely a consequence of policy choices by the current government, which has deliberately liberalised migration rules and set targets for roughly 500,000 new permanent residents each year. This 1% increase was significantly larger than the growth that the Canadian economy experienced that quarter. In fact, it shrank by 0.1%, which means that GDP per capita actually fell. This would be fine if it was a one-off thing, but it's not. According to a study by the Fraser Institute, in 5 of the 6 quarters between the middle of 2022 and the end of 2023, Canada's population grew by more than its economy. While we don't have complete data for the first 2 quarters of 2024, the fact that growth has come in well below analysts' expectations suggests something similar happened then too. This means that, even though Canada's GDP is rising, its GDP per capita is falling. In other words, the Canadian economy is in some sense getting bigger, but Canadian living standards are also actually falling. In fact, according to that Fraser Institute study I mentioned a moment ago, GDP has declined from about $60,000 in the second quarter of 2022, when it peaked post-COVID, to about $58,000 in the fourth quarter of 2023, representing a decline of about 3.4%. This is pretty astonishing. Obviously, we generally expect that GDP per capita should increase over time, barring exceptional circumstances. But this means that Canada's GDP per capita has now fallen to below where it was in 2014. The steep rise in immigration has also made Canadians less positive about immigration, pushed up Canada's unemployment to a 2-year high of 6.4%, and exacerbated its housing crisis, which is one of the worst in the world. The average house price in Canada has skyrocketed from roughly 250,000 Canadian dollars in 2005 to about $750,000 today, and the ratio between median house price and median wage has risen from 3 in the 90s to nearly 6 today. On top of that, particularly popular cities like Vancouver and Toronto are literally some of the least affordable cities in the world, with the ratio reaching 12 in Vancouver and nearly 10 in Toronto. As we mentioned in other videos, housing crises are generally bad for economies. They exacerbate inequality, push down fertility rates, and even reduce productivity, i.e. GDP or output per hour of work. This is largely because high house prices deny even diligent people the opportunity to work in highly productive areas. In Canada's case, that's cities like Calgary, Toronto, and Ottawa. This might be one of the main reasons that Canada also has a productivity crisis on its hands at the moment. In fact, Canada has seen almost zero productivity growth since 2015, and real wages have actually fallen. So if neither Canada's productivity nor its GDP per capita are actually growing significantly, this means that Canada's GDP is only growing because of immigration and because Canadians are working longer hours. This is in part why, in April, the Trudeau government promised a wildly optimistic plan to build an extra 2 million units of housing by 2031, well short of the 3.5 million that academics think Canada needs to bring house prices down to their historical norm, but enough to put Canada's home-to-resident ratio on par with the rest of the G7. Unfortunately for Trudeau, though, so far house building rates haven't increased, and Canada is only on track to build about 200,000 new homes this year, well below the 550,000 required by Trudeau's new plan. Anyway, if this housing crisis isn't resolved, it could be really dangerous for the Canadian economy. Mortgages have pushed Canada's private debt level to about 200% of GDP, one of the highest in the world, and even higher than Japan before its massive real estate crash in the 90s. While their housing market has survived the recent rate hikes, largely thanks to new demand from recent immigrants, if it were to crash, it would push Canada into a Japan-style crisis, which could be disastrous. Now, you can keep diving deeper into this and other news stories over on Nebula, where the TLDR team curates the most important news videos from around the world, saving you from a deluge of bad news and helping you pay attention to what really matters. This means no more feeling out of touch. On Nebula News, the TLDR team act as your guide through the media landscape, sharing the news that we're paying attention to and helping you to find the stories that matter and avoid burnout. Now, if you don't know already, Nebula is a streaming service that we co-own with a bunch of your favorite creators. There, you can watch original content like Real Life Law's incredible series War Room, which every month runs you through a whole load of ongoing conflicts, keeping you in the loop. You can also watch every TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in many instances, before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, then you can click the link in the description to sign up now. And if you do, you'll get 40% off an annual plan by using our link. Plus, Nebula will know that you came from us, which really helps us out. We've got some great feedback from existing members on the Nebula News features, so I hope you enjoy the effort that we're putting into Nebula News.